Here's a fun fact. The town of Lyndhurst, New Jersey, currently home to Medieval Times Dinner and Show, used to be called Kingsland. Medieval Times, with the knights and jousting, was built in a town that used to be called Kingsland. Do you still doubt simulation theory? Less fun fact. In 1917, it exploded, and unlike any of the other many similar incidents that have occurred in the Garden State over the years, over 20 of them between 1900 and 1950, this time they actually caught the perp. Well, kind of, but I'll get into that. And considering the year, it surely comes as no shocker that it was a German guy. Spoiler. The Kingsland munition factory explosion of 1917. As previously discussed on Words and Coffee, New Jersey was once a booming place for those that made booms. Proximity to major cities meant labor, rail networks, and ports, and so on. In 1916, this is where shop was set up by the Canadian Car and Foundry Company. The operations at Kingsland focused on the last stage of production, known as load and pack. That's the critical stage where explosives are actually melted and poured, turning otherwise inert metal containers into Satan's Easter eggs. This operation is performed in several steps, including shell prep, which consisted of wiping down each shell body with gasoline to remove dust, machining oil, and other residue. Cleaning was done in building number 30, which was dedicated to this purpose. At the time, the factory was under contract to process 3 million explosive shells per month. Hence, a great deal of energetic material and completed artillery shells were stored on site, to the tune of millions of pounds. Now, despite the US still technically being neutral at this time, Canada was not. Thus, plant managers recognized the need for security. A 6-foot tall wall surrounded the entire complex of 40 buildings, and controlled access points were guarded 24 hours a day. This will be relevant later. January 11th, 1917. New Jersey may not be that far north, but winters here still suck. It was so cold that the nearby river and marshlands had frozen over. Even so, when a fire started in Building 30, the shell cleaning building, it was not met with sighs of relief, but rather cries of distress. So remember how they cleaned the empty shells with gasoline prior to pouring in the high explosive fill? I intentionally neglected to mention the nitty-gritty of precisely how that was done. The SOP consisted of an open paint pan of gasoline, which the operator would then apply a rag affixed to a piece of wood and then proceed to swab out the interior of the shell body. Gasoline-soaked rags. Yes, really. I couldn't get numbers of how many personnel were in this particular building, but considering that they were processing 3 million bodies per month, let's say conservatively that there were like 10 workers per shift. That's 10 stations with open gasoline tubs and rags to soak them up, in a facility that processes millions of pounds of high explosives. Yeah, thus, when fire broke out, in that building, everyone knew right away that this was not going to be a good day. So take a guess. No cheating. How many people do you think were killed in this event? 10? 100? Try 0. Literally how, you ask? Well, where most stories of this kind feature multiple heroes in the form of rescuers and other first responders, in this case we have a singular hero, or rather heroine, Tessie McNamara. Tessie operated the switchboard at the Car and Foundry Company. For those of you born after like 1991, that's the person that facilitated calls between the various buildings by moving plugs and wires from one spot to another. For reasons I'll get to in a moment, the fire spread quickly, consuming all of Building 30, and soon spreading to others as a result of high winds and abundant availability of combustible material. Remember all that gasoline? Eventually, it reached storage, where the finished shell bodies were located. And once they started to cook, it was only a matter of time before they started to really cook. Which brings us back to Tessie and how she saved 1,400 people. Okay, I am irrationally afraid that I might undersell this, but here goes. Tessie's got a plaque and she earned it. Tessie's assignment as switchboard operator was originally supposed to be temporary, but as these things seem to do, she ended up getting stuck there because her bosses didn't have time to train anyone else on that machine. And so there she stayed until the freaking worst day of her life. Upon learning about the fire, Tessie started calling each individual building, recall there were 40 of them, well, 36 by the time she got to the end, and told them to get clear. I quote, "Get out or go up," as in go up in flames. She stayed at her post and completed 36 calls. Presumably, 4 buildings had been destroyed by the time she could get through the list. During that time, shells had started to cook off and explode, launching more projectiles, which fell across the facility and the surrounding towns. Just 10 minutes had passed since the fire started. As she tells it, one passed through the wall, not 5 feet from where she was sitting. So the next time your boss asks you to work a Saturday, and that seems like the worst thing ever, here's a little perspective. For the workers, getting Tessie's call was only part one. Once outside, there were several complicating factors. Recall that 6-foot wall surrounding the entire complex? The only exit was a 12-foot gate that all 1,400 workers on shift were now swarming to. This bottleneck drove many of them to take their chances climbing over the barbed wire fence, which they did. Dropping to the other side, they were only able to escape by crossing the frozen Hackensack River and swampy marshes, getting covered head to toe with muddy slime in the process. Recall this was the middle of January. On the other hand, had the river not been mostly frozen over, many would have remained trapped for what came next. When the first of the shell bodies cooked off, it spread flaming debris and more explosives in every direction. Some of those landed near the switchboard operator building, from which Tessie had been sending her warnings. Others fired off into the surrounding towns in a steady roar that lasted for several minutes. They crashed into houses, shattered chimneys, and damaged car repair buildings for the railroad. Rail lines up to 300 feet away were torn up by the blast. As those 1,400 workers fled the immediate danger, they warned nearby residents, who, to be fair, were already preparing to flee upon hearing the explosions in the first place, and that just added to the chaos. A newspaper account of the time put it thusly: thousands of these missiles were flung aloft, and for minute after minute the sky rained red and golden fire, illuminating the darkening meadows with a weird glare that threw into relief the tiny figures of fugitives racing, tumbling, falling across the marshes in a mad scramble to get from beneath the hail of molten metal.
That is the most metal thing I ever heard in my whole life.
At some point, Tessie and any remaining staff were ushered out of the building by firefighters, thus completing the evacuation. In all, 500,000 shells exploded over the course of the night, destroying 38 buildings at the car and foundry company and damaging countless other homes and structures. By morning, the explosions were finally done, and the immediate danger had passed. Except for any number of unexploded ordnance that would now have to be cleaned up, there was nothing left to do but for folks to try and pick up the pieces of their lives and get back to the business of living. But fortunately, they would have that opportunity, thanks almost entirely to Tessie's heroism. And that's it. That's the story of the Kingsland munitions factory explosion. Except, alright, this part's a doozy. So let's start with the obvious. If Tessie was our hero, then we must also have a villain. And, unsurprisingly for the time, it's a German guy.
Which was the style at the time.
But in order to tell you that story, first I have to tell you this story. The German Empire had agents on the ground in the United States and other places during World War I. One cell that we know of was established in Baltimore within the otherwise legitimate offices of an international shipping company. And that's where Friedrich Hinsch operated from. Who was Hinsch? Kind of a prick, to be honest. His role was leader of the German sabotage efforts in the US. Aside from the Kingsland explosion, he was also implicated in the Black Tom explosion in Jersey City, a related story for another time. There was also a plan to poison horses and mules, plant cigar bombs on transport ships, and good old-fashioned labor strikes organized at munitions factories. So yeah, busy boy. And Hinch's role is not disputed. What is less clear is what connection, if any, existed between Hinch and the next two alleged saboteurs. Kurt Tumel, aka Charles Torn, was the assistant employment manager at the car and foundry company. This too is not disputed. Where it gets dicey is whether he sought that position at the behest of Hinch. Why does that matter? Because Kurt was responsible for hiring Theodore Wozniak, the operator in Building 30, where the fire originated. So what about Wozniak? Turns out he had prior association with the German Empire as a draftee in the Austro-Hungarian army. Oh my. And the fire started at his workstation. And his coworkers saw him dousing accelerant on the fire? And when he was called in for questioning, he acted uncomfortable. And then when the Fed boys got involved, he skipped town? What? Okay, so getting back to the topic at hand, I gotta break this down here. So, everything I just mentioned is factual, but the devil, as they say, went down to Georgia.
If you lose, the devil gets your soul.
So, what happened here? I mean, really? Well, they were using gasoline soaked rags to clean out metal parts at a facility that processed high explosives. And our boy Theo had a pile of this stuff at his workstation. Your friendly neighborhood OSHA rep just had himself a mild heart attack. And this business about him supposedly pouring flammable liquid on the fire once it started. All right, so you don't put water on an oil fire. Ask me how I know. So they naturally had sand in Building 30 for just this purpose. But what's the gut reaction of literally anyone when they see a fire? Yeah, you put water on it. Thus, when old Mr. Wozniak's coworkers, who, let's be honest, might well have had an axe to grind with him, saw him attempting to douse the immediate fire at his workstation with the nearest liquid on hand, which unfortunately, yes, turned out to be more flammable liquid, thus spreading the fire, their response was, J'accuse! Meanwhile, Theo's going,
We fucked up.
let's break it down. I don't think we need to be too charitable to see that the most likely explanation was thus. Dude's on the job for a couple of weeks, doing his best to punch in and punch out on time. It's not much, but it's a steady paycheck and keeps him in beer and sauerkraut sandwiches. Until one day, the literal pile of gasoline soaked rags, which were specifically given to him by his employer to perform said job, caught fire. How? Don't know. At no point did any credible witnesses claim that Theodore actually initiated the fire, only that he, quote, poured an accelerant on it after the fact. Which frankly sounds to me like he panicked with the realization there was a fire in a building full of gasoline. Thus, he grabbed the nearest liquid at hand, which, yes, turned out to be more accelerant, instead of the bucket of sand, which he was supposedly trained to do and was SOP. Let me guess. The bucket of sand was briefly mentioned on like his first day orientation and never came up again after that. But he confessed. In 1942, Wozniak was being considered for internment as a German national, and yes, it wasn't just those of Japanese descent that were so interned, and it supposedly came up during this interview that, why, yes, that was me that set the fire 15 years ago. I was paid $40 a week by the local spy master to be on retainer. Yeah, yeah, okay, maybe. Frankly, considering the time and incentives for all those involved, I find that series of events just a little, shall we say, questionable. This was all documented in a 1931 report, by the way. A report whose sole purpose was to establish German culpability in the context of war reparations. The whole point of the report was to prove that Germany conducted sabotage in the US so they would have to pay the US for damages after the war, with every incentive to prove German involvement. And that report still concluded that the fire was accidental. Wozniak's supposed responsibility didn't come out until years later during that 1942 interview I mentioned. All right, so what about that interview? It's unclear if anything ever came of it. You'd think that if it were true, the authorities would be gung ho to point out, yeah, we solved the case! In fact, let's explore that for a moment. POV. You're a German agent who acquired access to a sensitive munitions production site on enemy soil. Your goal is to disrupt operations in the name of the fatherland. You are paid a substantial sum toward this purpose. After weeks of patience, you see your opportunity and go for it. Beyond your wildest expectation, the act is successful and the entire facility is reduced to rubble. Not just your building, but the entire complex. Ha ha! Victory for the Kaiser! And then you kind of just hang around for the next 20 years, only to be picked up when the fatherland goes to war. Again, does anyone buy that? Does anyone buy that? Thus, to summarize, Friedrich Hinch was a spy master, and his goal was to disrupt and sabotage the Allied production effort. To that end, he probably did seek out and even paid potential agents to do so. And yes, several facilities were damaged around this time period. Black Tom and Sayreville both come to mind, as well as several others in Pennsylvania. Now, did Frederick organize that, or were they all, shall we say, happy accidents? Hmm. This was a disaster, certainly, but thankfully, no one died. That's not to say that it wasn't extremely stressful for those who lived through it, not least of all the residents at nearby Snake Hill. Snake Hill is a topic unto itself, and I have it on my little to do list. But to briefly summarize, at various times it performed a number of roles, such as cemetery, almshouse, prison, and asylum.
Told him what you told me to tell him. I told him I was in sanitation. Yeah.
I told you to tell him he was in a sanitarium.
During the events in question, it was those last three. Now, I say this from a place of compassion, but imagine 900 mentally ill individuals stuck inside an asylum, dead of winter, with an end of the world explosion and fire occurring just next door. Probably a little stressful for the patients as well as the staff, I think you would agree. They watched from the windows, seeing what was later described by the superintendent as an enormous display of fireworks, but like way more intense than you would expect. For a variety of reasons, they couldn't flee, and so the staff, to their credit, improvised, claiming that the explosions were, quote, celebrating the end of the Great War. On top of that, the chairman of the hospital committee, James Mahan, went out to buy ice cream, fruit, and candy to help keep the patients calm. Though who he was buying from at this time is anyone's guess. Like, who was open, selling candy. But, at any rate, a nice wholesome story to this thing. Meanwhile, commuters to and from New York City were stranded as trains came to a complete halt, in some cases for several hours. Imagine, you just got off your 12-hour shift making nails by hand. Not really, but go with it. And you're trying to get home to your wife and 11 kids. That part's more likely. And the train comes to a complete stop due to raining hellfire in Secaucus. Perhaps unsurprisingly, during this time, several commuters tried to raid the dining car and probably the bar as well. Because train traffic stopped for safety reasons, and since this was in the time before just in time delivery or refrigeration, no perishable food items such as dairy or produce made it to New York for an entire day. Not quite medieval siege levels of deprivation, but just try to imagine the roughly 10,000 baristas in the 5 boroughs of New York City today telling their customers that they will be unable to make pink foamy nonsense for the entire day. Seriously, imagine it. And finally, an estimated 40,000 people were packed into Hoboken Station, less than 5 miles from the blast, where they remained trapped for several hours, either hiding or waiting for train service to resume. Literally my personal hell. Years later, Germany, quote, admitted guilt and agreed to pay reparations. Because it was the 1950s and we really didn't give them a choice. As mentioned, Teddy Wozniak was picked up by the Internment Bureau leading up to World War II, leading to renewed interest in his involvement in the 1917 incident. And then he disappeared. No record. Did he do it? Eh. Tessie, on the other hand, was immediately recognized as the hero of the hour. She remained in Lyndhurst for 52 years before eventually moving to East Rutherford. For those unfamiliar with the area, that's literally next door, where she lived to a ripe old age, passing away in 1971. A curious but coincidental inversion of the year that made her famous. And famous she was, becoming a local folk hero. Her memorial is located within the larger Kingsland Memorial at 213 Clay Avenue in Lyndhurst. It all serves as a fine closer to a story of local heroes, villains, and a piece of New Jersey history. That'll about do it for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. Sources in the description as usual. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.